Okay, friends, so this is the fifth video lecture, I believe, on the period of early childhood. And this one is over cognitive development. We're going to continue with the topic of cognitive development. Here, I want to talk about this idea of theory of mind. So theory of mind is the theory that you have a mind or that other people have a mind. Specifically, when we're talking about children and cognitive development, this is the idea that a child understands that people think differently. Now, our textbook breaks down the concept, which is to me was really interesting. I hadn't read this in other places. Breaks down the concept of theory of mind into at least three other categories, or to illustrate the depth or the complexity of this concept. So, for instance, a 2-year-old has come to or is capable of understanding that there's a diversity of desires, that they may like cookies and you may like cake, or they may like strawberries and you may like broccoli, so that there's different opinions on what we want. A 4-year-old is capable of understanding this concept of false belief. Now, I put into the module a video that explains false belief a little bit better, but imagine a scenario where you have, I think the video says you have these two children, you have Betty and Bob, and Betty puts her marble in her basket, and then Betty leaves the room. Well, Bob takes Betty's marble and puts it inside his box, and then Betty comes back. Where is Betty going to look for the marble? Does she look in her basket where she left it, or does she look in the box where Bob put it? Children in the age of 4 have come to understand that she will look in her basket, but before age of 4, people will assume that Betty knows that Bob moved the marble because the child knows. And instead of not understanding that Betty has different information or false beliefs, that Betty holds the false information because she didn't see Bob move the marble. And so this really gets into the ability to understand or to conceptualize that people think differently than you do. The textbook actually suggests that children who have siblings, especially older siblings, will grasp this false belief idea sooner than children who don't have siblings. And that does kind of make sense because, well, to me it makes sense because your siblings are going to interact with you and maybe hide or you'll watch your siblings hide toys, whereas an only child, I wouldn't necessarily catch that. And then by middle childhood, a child is capable of understanding that people don't always act how they feel, that somebody may be capable of hiding their feelings. We learn that around middle childhood. Also, what goes on in this other elements of cognitive development is language development. Vocabulary is developing very, very quickly. At 2, a child may have only 200 words. By the time they get to 5, they may have 10,000 words. And this is what psychologists call fast mapping. So, if you spend much time with children, you'll notice that their vocabulary grows very, very quickly. There is a little discussion in your textbook about how children of different, who come from different language backgrounds, so I believe it says Japanese, who are verb friendly vocabularies, they learn nouns first. Some of what children have to learn in this as their vocabulary develops are like the difference between literal and figurative meaning. They have a tendency, there's this phenomenon called overgeneralizing. There's lots of sort of linguistic terms. But somebody who's very important that maybe you'll hear about in other contexts is this fellow by the name of Chomsky, Noam Chomsky. And he argued that he's a linguistics, and he's basically a linguistics and a philosopher and an economist and a historian. He writes in all, I've heard him described as writing in more genres than any other intellectual. And he argued that we all have something called a language acquisition device, and that humans are innately programmed to learn language. Like we are born primed with learning how to develop language in order to communicate with our fellow humans. And one of the observations that he's made is that children all over the world learn the grammar of the language that they are a part of before anyone actually teaches them grammar. Like they learn sentence construction without being told how to put a sentence together. And the argument being is that this is an innate part of our human experience to learn language so that we can communicate. All right. So this is also obviously a period where we're paying attention to early childhood education. This slide simply represents a bunch of different kinds of different philosophies around different kinds of early childhood education. I'm going to actually, I'll create a little sort of matching exercise to match up the different philosophies between like a Montessori school. One thing that is worth noting is that the cultural and even the legislative acknowledgement that early childhood education is important for future development, like this has been documented over and over again, that children who get quite high quality early childhood education, they perform better in math, they perform better in reading, their brain's development, that it was even established that in 1965 is when we established public early childhood education, but specifically it was for children who were considered at risk, which generally means poor kids, and that's what we call Head Start, was established in 1975. There's also a brief discussion in this chapter about some of the cognitive, I hate to call them, I don't like to use the terms disabilities, but certainly cognitive differences. And the one that we are probably the most familiar with is autism spectrum disorder, which is interesting that we call it spectrum disorder because, oh gosh, 10 years ago, before when we had the DSM-4, we're now in the DSM-5, it actually separated, you had autism separated out from Asperger's. But it seems to me everybody knows basically what autism is, but maybe that's not true. Some of the hallmark characteristics of autistic, my son is on the spectrum. The hallmark characteristics are what we might call social deficits. So children, people who are on the spectrum are really less capable of picking up all the subtle cues and social interactions. And so for me, that's always like, that's what I notice. Things like, the social cues about personal space or eye contact, taking turns in conversation, the volume of one's voice. So these social deficits translate or are often exacerbated by communication deficits or these repetitive behaviors. They do the same thing over and over again. Some of that may be self-stimulation where they rock back and forth, or maybe they have a very narrow topic of interest. They only really like one thing. They often are very sensitive to sounds or sights or touch. I remember with William, especially if I go back to this stage of his life, it was socks, and he could not stand socks that had a seam, right? Well, every single sock, I challenge you to find some socks that don't have a toe seam. And so we would go through so many socks every morning trying to get dressed for preschool because if they felt wrong, or underwear. He didn't like the way his underwear felt. But he is very, very sensitive. Another thing that can be very frustrating is sounds that you and I may not notice. They may be very sensitive to lights, textures, textures of foods, flavors, and so it may result in a child that doesn't that's very narrowly focused, that's very, very sensitive, doesn't know how to take turns, doesn't know how to turn their volume down, and all of this sort of makes it difficult to interact and make friends. And they do say that early diagnosis is best. It helps the parents figure out how to adopt, right? Manage symptoms here, applied behavioral analysis. So let's figure out what this child needs to know so that they can adopt social skills or adopt patterns of behavior that will help make them successful, and will manage the behavior, right? So, and the goal being that we have to modify behaviors that will promote social and emotional success. There does seem to be some evidence that Asperger or ASD, autism spectrum disorder, runs in families. So there is some element of a genetic component. There are some neuroanatomical abnormalities, meaning that there are, what does that word, neuroanatomical? So that would be brain structure, right? Some evidence that the brain structured, and there does seem to be some evidence that there may be some environment. All I can say from my own experience is I see some of the same characteristics in my husband that I see in my son, and I am familiar or aware of some of the same behaviors that my father had that my son also had. So I'm willing to acknowledge that there is a genetic component. Okay, well, this is going to wrap up the section on cognitive development and early childhood. The next set of videos are going to be on social and emotional development.